after this if it were passed.
Right.
I wouldn't hold my breath. But.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's visit to India comes at a delicate time for relations between the two countries. President Donald Trump's aggressive stance on a number of issues, trade, immigration, Iran, have all put India in a somewhat uncomfortable spot. This visit also comes ahead of a bilateral meeting between Trump and Prime Minister Modi that is scheduled on the sidelines of the G20 summit at the end of this week in Japan. What should we make of where India-US ties stand right now? Joining us to talk about that are Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to the United States, Virendra Gupta, former deputy director at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, and Bharat Karnad, research professor for national security studies at the Center for Policy Research. Ambassador Shankar, let me start with you. Trade has been a flashpoint for the last many months, and after much delay, India has imposed some retaliatory tariffs on a number of American goods. Do you find any room for conciliation on this anytime soon, or is this likely to remain a flashpoint as long as President Trump is in office?
Well, I think the two countries will engage on trade issues on a broad spectrum. That's the only way forward. Strategically, there are broad and deep convergences, as Foreign Secretary Jaishankar has said, but there are also issues on which there are divergences of perspective. To the east of us in Asia, I think we have strong convergences. But if we look at Iran, or if we look at India's relationship with Russia, our ability to buy weapons and equipment from them, these are all issues on which there are divergences of perspective and a need to iron them out as we move forward. Clearly for India, we need to be able to have the freedom of choice to buy weapons from any country or any system that we find appropriate. And I think it can't really depend on, case-by-case waiver each time with Russia, because this flies in the face of our existing relationship with Russia. Yes, we want very good defense ties with the US. We want to be able to purchase, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has said that the US is prepared to help India build its defense capabilities. But I think the choice from where we want to, buy weapons and equipment must rest with India, of course, keeping in mind sensitivities of our partners. But at the end of the day, I think that would be a very critical issue for India. Right. And on the trade side, I think there are a number of issues which have come together. The withdrawal of GSP benefits, the H-1B visa tightening through executive orders, now some talk of a cap which has been denied. And on the other side, the US side, there are, the prices fixed for medical devices, the data localization, the e-commerce policies. There are a range of issues from both sides. And I think we would need to engage in a spirit of give and take to try to find a way forward on these economic issues.
I'll come to the defense purchases, Iran and Russia in just a bit. Just to stick on to trade for a little longer, there has been action on the goods front. Within services trade, Ambassador Gupta, India's focus has largely been on ensuring that Indians looking to work in America continue to get the maximum opportunity. The H-1B point that Ambassador Shankar raised. We've heard from the Trump administration pretty hawkish views on the H-1B visa issue. Is this too an area where India needs to be prepared to probably face a few setbacks and be prepared to have to limit how many people are able to find work in America here on?
Look, H-1B
could be an emotive issue with people wanting jobs in America. But as far as our national interests are concerned, it is a non-issue in my view. Because firstly, it is the flight of the trained manpower out of country, which is not really in our country's overall interest. You do have a situation that we cannot find adequately qualified IT professionals to work in India. So that is a deleterious situation and we must deal with it. So I don't think we ought to shed much tears on the issue of H-1B. However, H-1B is going to affect all companies in the same manner. And I guess because the Indian companies offer competitive services, it is in the long term not going to make any impact on their business opportunities in America. But this is a very important relationship politically, strategically, and I think everything has to be seen in that perspective.
Fair enough.
The trade issues, in my opinion, are rather minor,
right.
Because it is also posturing. And as Ambassador Meera Shankar said, there are issues which need to be sorted out in a give and take spirit. Clearly, America has certain reservations, certain grounds, and they are putting it on the table. And I'm happy that our government has not ruled out discussions and negotiations on those issues. As Foreign Minister Jaishankar has said, this is really the task of diplomacy to negotiate. And the last point that I'd like to make is that it is very symbolic of the kind of importance that America attaches. I've never seen previously Secretary of State, which is a very high-ranking government official in the American administration, coming down to India to prepare for the visit of, or for the bilateral meeting that is scheduled on the sidelines of the G20 meeting. So I think the very fact that Pompeo has chosen to visit India at this time, immediately on the eve of the bilateral meeting scheduled, shows that America attaches importance to its relationship. This relationship has been growing.
Right.
There is a strong strategic convergence. And what we must remember is that we need America. America is the largest country in the world, largest economic power, largest diplomatic, political power. But I think we must also remember that America also needs us.
Right.
And I think unless you remember that, we cannot begin to leverage our position with America in order to secure the most optimum terms in our relationship.
I'll come to the challenges of a multipolar world in just a bit. Just before that, Mr. Karnad, turning to a number of strategic issues on defense purchases, what do you make of America's conditional support, if I may call it that, as long as India refrains from going through with the S-400 missile defense system? This afternoon's language that we heard from Secretary Pompeo was a little more conciliatory than what you've heard from Washington lately.
Well, the point I think to make is, and to remember, is that the Trump, the art of deal making, that is President Trump's supposed specialty, is essentially it's all take and no give. So far, unfortunately, the Indian method of negotiation is all give and no take. So, that complements each other in some sense, because we have been giving far more than we ought to have been doing all these years. Now, the problem really is, someone here said that, Pompeo's coming here is, symbolic of something big, or the importance that's attached to India and so on. These are the sorts of things, small gestures, with which some of us get hugely impressed by. There are larger issues at stake. So when we start talking about India, the United States meaning a whole lot more, or rather featuring very largely in our scheme of things, and then in some sense minimizing India's strategic assets and leverages, which we scarcely use, then we have a problem.
Right.
Because the point, I think, I turn it around and say the United States requires India far more than we do require the United States. And this really comes to a head where Iran is concerned. I mean, we have, Trump is out there trying to fight with everybody, screwing up relations left and right and creating a whole lot of chaos. Fine, that is disruptive policy, and disruptive policies invariably, have a premium. They get results. I mean, that's precisely why I've been recommending for years together that we be a little bit more disruptive than accommodating. We tend to accommodate far more, even at the expense of our national interest. Now, consider Iran in particular. Our entire strategy for Afghanistan, Central Asia, connection through the Northern Distribution Network in Russia to Europe, etc., all goes for a toss. If we sort of lie down and have Trump literally steamroll the Indian policy into compliance. We can't afford to do that.
Fair enough.
We have already accommodated them by reducing the energy offtake by some, by considerable amount. And then we are hardly an energy self-sufficient country. And we were getting very good terms. We're getting energy on time, and all kinds of benefits are accruing to us. And we have, in a very, very thoughtless manner, surrendered all that just to please Washington.
Right.
I don't see the point of it. What have we got in return?
Ambassador Shankar, on the point of Iran, as Professor Karnad said, we have drawn down our energy supplies considerably. There are other strategic interests, the Shabar port that Minister Jaishankar mentioned, and others. There have been cultural ties, societal ties between the two countries over thousands of years. Where do you see India positioned in this situation? And if I may take a slight leap of imagination, being in the peculiar position of being ally, friend, whatever you may call it, to both those nations. Is there any scope for India to play a role? It has been unnatural to some of the Scandinavian countries of being playing peacemaker between the two, if at all.
I think firstly, there is a carve out for Chabahar, but the US, for India's port project in Iran, but only to the extent that it services Afghanistan. And if we are unable to really use it for delivery of oil supplies or for other, trades with Iran, then I think the commercial viability of the port certainly gets affected if its scope is narrowed down to just really providing humanitarian assistance and other essential supplies to Afghanistan. So we have to see how we work this through. And yes, our relationship with Iran is multifaceted. We have close ties. I think we are the second largest Shia community in the world after Iran. And they have very close cultural ties with their Iranian counterparts. They have not been radicalized. They have not been a radical community in India, and that has been something which all governments in India have welcomed. We have a large community of Indian origin in the Gulf, which would be impacted if tensions actually degenerate into actual conflict. So there are a number of issues, apart, of course, from the fact that our balance of trade and our current account deficit would certainly increase. The price of petrol and diesel would increase in India, and it would derail quite a lot of the government's economic policies if prices continue on such a high.
Right.
So we are going to be quite badly impacted if there is actually a war between the US and Iran. I don't think that we can really, play a role as a peacemaker beyond, urging that differences be resolved through discussions and negotiations. I think the Europeans are trying very hard because the Iranians have put the Europeans on notice, saying that if within the 60-day period that they had specified, Europe doesn't step up to the mark in helping them to overcome or go around
then Iran
the
will back out
sanctions
the deal with them as well.
Unilaterally opposed, then Iran will start reneging on its commitments under the nuclear deal. They have already gone beyond the limits, stockpile limits for low-enriched uranium. The next step they want to do is to start enriching uranium at a higher level than the low-enriched uranium stockpiles that they have, and so on. So actually, the incentive for Iran to continue with the nuclear deal would certainly reduce if the international community is unable to help Iran economically.
Right. Mr. Karnad, on terrorism and the recent events with Pakistan back in February, is it fair to say that President Trump's comments in Hanoi were indicative of the direct hand that Secretary Pompeo played intervening with Pakistan to cool things down? Does that indicate support on this issue, or was that just specific to that instance? We've also had in the last 24 hours the outgoing FATF president saying blacklisting Pakistan is very much a possibility. On that issue, is India gaining enough from this relationship? You just said in your last answer that a number of others were on the losing side, but the events of the last 4 months, do they indicate that on India's trouble with Pakistan, the country's been able to get the support of the United States as much as it can?
Well, look, I mean, just to repeat what General Ziaul Haq told Jimmy Carter when he offered some aid or something, he said, that's peanuts. If you want us to be a frontline state on Afghanistan, you have to give a lot more. So that ought to be our attitude, actually, to the United States. If you want us to be a frontline state on China, because they can't do without us, then you better then work up your laws and everything else to make it possible for us to cooperate with you. But that's not our attitude, is it? We just are, as I said, we are so subservient to everybody, every outside power, including the United States. Now, in terms of the terrorism, angle and so on, well, as I said, what have they done? I mean, these are very small things for them to do. And we expend so much of our political capital, diplomatic capital, on gaining these small successes, as I've argued, that the larger issues remain unaddressed. Terrorism, fine. You got, what's his name, Azhar Masood or whatever, being called a global terrorist or some such thing. Small satisfaction, really, because does anyone here really believe in the Indian government that GHQ Rawalpindi is now therefore going to give up on asymmetric warfare or use of terrorists? I mean, it's ridiculous. Our obsessing about Pakistan at the expense of the larger interests that are, where we are prepared to give in, and that really hurts our national interest. And the other point, and let me very quickly add, someone here said that Pompeo was conciliatory on S-400 or some stuff. For God's sake, there's a law there called Countering America Through the Sanctions Act, CATSA. So there's nothing that Pompeo or Trump or anybody else can do once the law has been, is on the books. That's the law. So all you're going to find Pompeo do in time is to say, oh, so sorry, I've done my best to try to push off the CATSA sanctions. I can't do much more. In other words, CATSA is right there like a Damocles' sword. And that's being used to pressure us into, severing our arms supply relationship with Russia and then hurting our larger partnership choices.
Right. Ambassador Gupta, I just want to take the point Professor Karnad just made on China a little further and trying to interpret the stance the Indian diplomatic community and the government has taken over the last few years. You had tension for the first 2 years of this government. The Trump administration came in timing with around the time when you saw Dayton, the Wuhan meeting. Was that meeting indicative of the Indian establishment not being sure of sustained American support from what seems to be a very transactional administration?
Well, China, I'm glad that you mentioned China, because China is the elephant in the room.
Right.
And if you care to look deeper, that is the reason that America needs India, to counter China's growing influence and the competition that it's providing to America. We also, on our part, facing the heat from China on many fronts. On diplomatic fronts, how China has continued to frustrate us in our efforts to gain access to Security Council, and a whole lot of issues. This is not the time to go into it. So I think there is, China provides that a strong strategic convergence that we've been talking about. Clearly, we have a lot of difficulty with China. Look at the trade front, for instance. I mean, our trade deficit with China is about in the order of between $50 to $60 billion. It may have improved a little bit lately, but it still is very, very large number. And in comparison with that, America is not only our largest trading partner, but we have a trade surplus with America. We have a huge trade in goods, services as well as apart from goods. So I think we have to manage both relationships separately. China is an altogether different thing. But the point that I'd like to make here is that there is need to manage our relationship with America from the standpoint of our national interest. And I fully agree with what Mr. Karnad said, that we cannot do so by caving in to pressures from America all the time. We got to calibrate, give in little bit wherever it is necessary. America is our very large trading partner, and we have to look at their concerns judiciously. And this may involve some giving in, fine. But insofar as Iran issue is concerned, our petroleum purchase from Iran, insofar as our defense purchases from Russia are concerned, these are very critical issues for us. And we have to assert, America must realize that India will not cave in to all kinds of pressures in this relationship. This is a relationship between equals. India must measure up to America, and I think that alone will ensure our national interest. We have to manage the relationship in a manner that our relations, our national interests are optimized in the most possible manner, in the best possible manner.
Ambassador Shankar, earlier in the conversation, you said that a number of things that piece by piece can be discussed and brought together to the point where both sides have something to take away. Could you enumerate some of those that you could see progress possibly made on in the coming weeks and months?
I think, it might be really jumping the issue because it's for the government to really take a view on these and see where there's scope for compromise and where there's need to dig our feet in. But I think overall as a package, we should be able to look at something. I mean, for instance, dairy, where the US wants to export dairy to India, but there we would have problems because they refuse to certify that the cows have not been fed with non-vegetarian feed. So that offends religious sentiments in India and becomes a really no-go issue for the Indian government. But there are other areas, for instance, capping of prices of medical devices. Is there some scope for give and take there? Is there some scope for tweaking the e-commerce policy? There are, many areas. And from our side, is there scope to see whether processing of H-1B visas could be streamlined, because it has become more difficult. And while some of my panelists were very sanguine that it's not an issue, it impacts the competitiveness of Indian companies because most of the Indian IT industry really supplies the US market or the European market.
Right.
And their ability to do so competitively naturally also depends on their being able to send people from India. If they have to hire American workers across the board, A, they are not available, and B, it pushes up the cost of doing business, reducing their competitiveness. So while many are changing their business model, it's out of necessity, and it's a structural issue for them which they have to confront.
I'll just round up my last round of questions to Professor Karnad and Ambassador Gupta. Professor Karnad, there's also been strategic and economic convergence for Indian interests in the Southeast Asian region. A number of those countries are wary of the Belt and Road project. The consequence of the trade war is such that some of those facilities that semi-finished goods move in and out of China and Southeast Asia and then move on to the rest of the world. Both strategically and economically, that's a region India has not been able to leverage. As much as we say what we'd like to do about China, the counterbalancing in the rest of the Chinese region, the way China has in the Indian Ocean, we've seen very little movement in being able to use the phrase, take these Southeast Asian nations on our side economically, strategically to increase the counterbalance against China at all.
Well, yeah. I mean, what our problem is that we just talk and talk some more and talk even more thereafter. We hardly act on our plans and policies that we have enunciated. For instance, there was, if you recall, Jaswant Singh, his External Affairs Minister, talked about the Ganga-Mekong connectivity. Remember that? Now, what's happened to that? That was the perfect way to, in a sense, bring in the Southeast Asian nations into the Indian economic orbit. But now, for 17 odd years now, we have just been just talking about it, doing nothing very much. In fact, we haven't even got our roads connected to Myanmar, an adjoining state, leave alone all the way to Mekong, Cambodia, Laos, and the rest of it, and all the way into the Gulf of Tonkin and Vietnam. So this is our problem. We talk and we don't act. Now, we haven't done anything in the last 15 years to promote that as a counterpoise, in some sense, as an alternative for Southeast Asian nations to the BRI. Now, BRI, there are substantive benefits accruing to states that, in a sense, subscribe to it. Now, with the absence of anything that India can offer, naturally, how long do you think the smaller nations, starting with, say, Laos and Cambodia, that are already in the Chinese camp, would they be willing to hold out? Because the inducements are too many, and the attraction of joining the Chinese in the economic sense are, obvious. So for India, because it never really follows up and does anything, our development assistance administration in the MEA, whatever it is, 1 and 2 and so on and so forth, again, is just there are hollow shells there. Very little work is being done because it's understaffed. People don't know what the heck is happening. The kind of financial investments required are not there and have not been made. The projects are half completed, those that have been started. So everybody has a complaint. And what we end up doing is losing our credibility. That's what's happened in Southeast Asia, as is the case also in Central Asia and elsewhere, and in Africa. So, our plans and our rhetoric seems fine, but the follow-up action is missing. And therefore, India is where it is. And China is sort of galloping along, while we'll then look to America and everybody else to pick our chestnuts out of the fire.
Let me round this up. Let me close this with seeing this relationship over a slightly longer curve, Ambassador Gupta. Over the last 2.5, 3 decades, going back 4 or 5 administrations and Congress cycles in America, traditionally Republican administrations and Republican Congresses have been more favored towards Indian interests, if I may call it, than the Democratic Party has been. Given that, would you call the last 2.5 years somewhat of a missed opportunity to push further on some of India's interests, or has this just been the realities of a Trump administration that does not conform to traditional Republican views in many matters, as has been for the last many decades?
No, I would say that the relationship has been growing steadily in the last decade or so, irrespective of which party has been in power in America. There are hiccups here and there, and different incumbents, presidents, have different style. So you have to grant that. And there is always posturing. As other participants have said, President Trump has a certain style of functioning. So I think that allowance has to be made. But if you look at it in the overall perspective, I'm quite happy the way the relationship is progressing. And it is happening not because of personalities, but because there is that strong strategic convergence which is driving both the nations together. So I think this cannot be helped. There are threats from international terrorism. That is an issue which is very much on President Trump's agenda. And he has turned up the heat, because of which he has taken a more strong position against Pakistan, which is, as I agree with Mr. Karnad, that is not really something that we ought to be very, gladden ourselves about. But there are very substantive issues where India is gaining from having a stronger relationship with the largest country in the world. I mean, all this while in the past, we indulge in rhetoric about following a certain principled approach in foreign policy. I think foreign policy is all about balancing your rhetoric in a manner that your national interests are served. And national interests cannot be served by having an indifferent relationship with the most important country in the world. When we began to improve our relationship with America, half of the world suddenly found merit in re-looking at India. They began to look at India with a more positive interest, just because America's relationship with India is improving. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is that there is a huge benefit for us in having an improved relationship with America, and I think that is what is driving us to have a better relationship with America. And America also sees the utility of having a better relationship with India in order to counterbalance China. I think that is a very, very important factor. So we can leverage that. And in overall terms, I would say the relationship has been improving steadily. Some people had in India misgivings about President Trump coming to power and what will happen to the relationship. But I think all of them have been proven wrong, because this relationship has grown steadily in the last 2.5 years.
Fair enough. Ambassador Gupta, Ambassador Shankar, Professor Karnad, thank you for making time for this conversation. On one interesting point, neither in the joint briefing that Minister Jaishankar and Secretary Pompeo held, nor in this conversation did the word Israel come up. That's one point that I found interesting. As this meeting happens at the end of the week, and as this relation develops further, we hope to reconnect with you to see how this key alliance or relations between the two countries move forward. If you have been, thank you for watching.